taken us by surprise. If you look back to the late 18th century was the time at which the great philosophers were pondering the fate of industrial civilization, the Enlightenment philosophers. The Enlightenment philosophers had a clear view of what our world would be like 200 years on. And this was based on a fairly simple, but I think very plausible precept, very simple theorem. The more we get to know about the world with the advance of science and technology, the more we get to know about ourselves and our own history, the more we can come to master the world, control our fate as human beings. This was the characteristic, with some simplification, Enlightenment view of the world. Enlightenment would bring a more predictable, orderly world. And even those people who didn't really like this world too much, like famous sociologist Max Weber, or the novelists Kafka or George Orwell, they still believed in this vision. They foresaw an orderly world in which we would all be like cogs in a gigantic machine. Weber's main worry for the future was that the world would be too tightly ordered, too tightly controlled, so that we wouldn't have any freedoms as individuals. Now, I suggest to you, if you look at our experience today, the beginning of the 21st century, the world does not look like this. The world in which we live, the beginning of the new century, does not look like a tightly ordered, rationally controlled world. Rather, it looks almost like the opposite, a world which is spinning out of our control, a world marked by fracturing, by dislocation, by a generalized feeling of uncertainty, which I think is reflected not only in uncertainties about the large institutions in the world in which we live, but uncertainties about our personal lives, our personal futures, our own intimate emotions too. Rather than being an ordered world, we live in what I'd sometimes call a runaway world, a world which is lurching towards futures which we don't fully understand. The Enlightenment thought of the future as like a kind of territory, and it was a bit like a colonial venture. They thought with the development of science and technology we will be able to conquer the territory of the future. Well, we haven't conquered that territory. The future to us looks perhaps even more opaque than it used to do in the past. The theme of this lecture really is what our life is like in this runaway world and what we can do to regulate and control it. Now, there are a number of dynamic forces which have produced this runaway world, but there's no doubt that one of the forces lying behind it, or the cluster of forces, is that related to the notion which was in the title of this lecture, the impact of globalization. The debate about globalization, I would like to propose to you, is the single most important debate of the beginning part of this century. The reason being is that it's a debate about what kind of world we're able to shape for ourselves, what kind of world we will be living in 10 or 20 or so years from now. The resolution of this debate, which is a very practical as well as an intellectual debate, will settle those questions.
Farther, faster, deeper, and cheaper than ever before, in a way that is enabling the world to reach into individuals, corporations, and nation-states. Farther, faster, deeper, cheaper than ever before. Globalization affects the poorest of the poor to the wealthiest of royalty. It affects everyone. How does globalization...
I want to assess what this debate means a bit later, but I'd first of all like to strongly suggest to you that you cannot be for or against globalization. That therefore, both sides in this debate start from a position which is essentially incoherent or untenable. The reason why you can't just be for or against globalization is that globalization is not a single force. It's absolutely central, at least to my way of thinking about these issues, to emphasize that the term globalization does not just stand for the global marketplace, does not just stand for the role of global financial markets, does not just stand for liberalization of the global economy. I take this to be a fundamental misapprehension of the changes which are really going on in the world, which are much more profound than this. Globalization is not a single phenomenon. It does not have a single source. You're talking about technological change. You're talking about the end of the Cold War. You're talking about transformations in political sovereignty. You're talking about the exhaustion of socialism as an ideology across the world. There are a cluster of factors shaping what the term you should use in quotes, really, globalization, because there's something rather different from how people ordinarily think of this phenomenon going on. You can't be for it or against it. You have to be for or against different aspects of it. You have to piece together what is a complicated phenomenon, work out what its benefits are for us, because I think there are plenty, but also work out what its destructive or negative downside is. One should therefore not understand by globalization purely an economic phenomenon. Even less than that should one understand by globalization simply liberalization of the global economy. What is it then how should one understand the term? I would like to suggest the following. Globalization is fundamentally a shorthand term to refer to a fundamental restructuring of the basic institutions of the societies in which we live, stretching all the way through from everyday life through to structures of sovereignty, through to transnational associations. There's like a seismic shift in the structuring of the basic institutions of our societies which is occurring. And you could, if you like, compare this, as some people do, to the late 18th century, because at that time you had like a sort of shakeout of basic institutions under the impact of the Industrial Revolution. You had change in the nature of the family, change in the nature of government, change in the nature of economy, of course, and also changes in the wider world system. Well, something like that, and kind of analog to that, but much more globalized, much more extensive, and much more intensive, because it reaches down into our personal lives much more, is going on today. Some people now suggest the term globalization should be abandoned because it covers a variety of different phenomena. I must say I have some sympathy with that, because if you use it as a single term, you do imagine you can be for it or against it, and you oversimplify both the dynamic causes of changes in the world and you underestimate, I think, the profundity of some of these changes. So globalization is not wholly economic. It is also social, cultural, political, certainly shifting the sovereign power of nations without completely transforming them. And it's also reaching down to I think, very personal, emotional aspects of our everyday life.